to India and Global Left. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Suraj Yengde. Um, he is a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. But apart from that, he is a prolific author and a Dalit activist, and we can go on, and we would just attach his introduction in the detail, but let's jump into our Q&A. So why not begin by, since one of our aims is uh, to melt some of the hard boundaries between academics on one hand and popular public sphere on the other hand. We intend to take some of these interesting works that are going on in academics, but also to bring them in the public sphere. So we'd like to begin with a contextualization of Martin Luther, and Dr. Ambedkar, and their relevance in our vision for a democratic international revolution to eliminate caste and race in particular, but also class. So would you please contextualize these two figures and their importance for our viewers?
I mean, we have to understand that these both figures, Jyotishman and Ayushman, thank you first of all for this invitation, and I'm very happy to meet and to all the friends and comrades who are gonna tune in and listen to them as well. See, we have to understand that the two figures that you mentioned, Dr. Ambedkar and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they're both, we're talking from a vantage point, but their ultimate aim was to attack and eventually handicap the notions of class-based society. Um, and, 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 and what are the notions? There are various notions that subsist and add a support to the structure of class-based system in various economies. It's political, but also you could say and examine it into a cultural context as well. And much of their fight was about giving a composite angle. So when we engage with the notion of race or notion of caste, we cannot subtract the ultimate decider that functions sometimes in periphery, sometimes in the core, which is the growing divide between the inequality that has risen through the economic vantage point. People have utilized culture then to signify or to justify uh, race or caste-based divisions. And then so when we look at these figures, we have to look at them as somebody who is already taking on the cudgels to eliminate the form of classism that has created divide, not least amongst me and them, but also within the intra communities, which is kind of developing more hazards as we see as we continue to work on towards a certain liberation. And thus when we need to contextualize these people, we need to pay attention that their struggle was also composite of liberating the oppressed sections of society, not least a black or a Dalit, but also amongst them they were female, they were people from marginalized geographies, and as we go on, we will see Martin Luther King Jr. Himself committed, as presented, but he committed socialist, talks about American imperialism. Dr. Ambedkar talks about Brahminism and capitalism, the kind of twin towers, and that's why his critique also comes from a very unique vantage point as being a scholar, but also as a national leader who looks at the nation as something that needs to be formed within a strong dynamics of eliminating these differences. And if class and caste and race and gender and other forms of divisions are existing, there is a way to kind of level that up. And that's how you will see they not only come from the various sides to address this issue, but sometimes they speak from what is their vantage point. And I think their vantage point was as a Dalit man or as a black man. but also what brought on responsibilities on them as a Dalit man or as a black man. And I think, and very essentially, their struggle is global because it's international struggle. It's a struggle for the liberation of the oppressed, and you will see they rely on various intellectual figures that have contributed to their own thinking, which is not mechanical. Unlike mechanical thinkers who have adopted a non-organic level of theory and then, of course, produce and also teach in university classes or on the street, there is a difference than the ones who are who are developing this kind of a new analysis when it comes to the caste-based, distinctions, or in this case, race-based distinctions.
Thank you so much. And also, just to add to that, that both also struggled against very similar forms of, hierarchies. For instance, the two most classic would be segregation, the denial to water resources, and also to education.
Yeah, yeah,
So there is definitely there has been linkages as well as there remains an aspiration to
yeah.
interconnect these struggles at a global level. Now, this also brings us to the second question, and here I would like to take up your very interesting essay on in the radical in Ambedkar, where you are suggesting an international organic politics, but also alternative institutions based on plural ethnicity, if one likes to use that, but not, of course, at a level of minority ethnicity. And so, one of the visions of this platform, if we like to say, is that we think that uh, for any kind of emancipatory politics, there has to be international security, international scrutiny, I'm sorry, about different form of hierarchies that go on at the
Yeah.
national and the local levels. And that becomes very important. We have seen in various cases, in the case of the struggle of the blacks, but also the Dalits in India, and your
Yeah.
essay deals with that. So tell us a little more about your vision of a politics of the oppressed international, if we can use that word, which should go beyond the typical conventional bourgeois, politics of race-based minority.
And we know one of the things we have to understand that um, the fight of the oppressed is smashing at the root, whereas bourgeois, now in contemporary context, the neoliberal ways of fighting is fighting on a context of street, but not going to the basics of creating a unionized politics or politics of the working class. That's a difference. And in that, we see much identity, and it has almost become an identitarian social state crisis where multiple forms of identities have asserted, and which is rightfully so, because human beings are categorized into identities, and now they're reclaiming the position. However, if it is not tied to the project of addressing the exploitation of human beings alongside the exploitation of animals, alongside the exploitation of environment, that politics is very much trying to reproduce a bourgeois culture under the norms of what we see today, shutdown, or not asking anyone else to speak, or what we have is social media based archetypes of new forms of cultural revolt. And it's very particular that these institutions are billionaire owned. Their stocks that have been traded are in massive numbers, but also they rely, and these are mostly imperial American based corporations who are based out of certain locations. Now, when we examine that, the Federal Bureau of Reserve, which is basically the war machine, if you will, for the corporates to go outside and plunge, and the kind of gold trading they do, especially with the US dollar. Now much of the stock that is taking place, that's exchanging and all, there is no actual wealth that they can claim of that much billion. It's this. Now Biden government is trying for the ungainable profits to be taxed, which is a very interesting. It will really bring much of this billionaire Raj into scrutiny, and because these people claim much of their non-gainable tax as something that could uh, is not there with them, right? But the stocks kind of work. So it's the money that is circulating between people. Basically, you put and you get a loss, someone else get. But the billionaire at the end of the day is a showrunner. Simply put, if you go on social media and argue something, doesn't matter who wins, the person who is owning the platform wins at the end of the day. And so when we look into the root cause of the oppressed international, what I call the fourth world concept, where we want to bring the people. See, the third world concept was a great concept, but it was mired by the petty bourgeois or the new elites formed during the colonial formation. In the post-colony, these were the people who became the neo-colonizers, what we call brown sahibs in the context. And same happened in Africa. They call the black leaders who, and this is Franz Fanon fear, and Ambedkar had ushered this fear phenomenally quite early on, and that's why he was opposed to this form of caste capitalist freedoms. Now we have to understand Ambedkar, and in this case, as you are bringing the similarities of Martin Luther King, there are so many similarities with them, not least for the struggle against segregation, because their common situation made them common as brothers. Although Dr. Ambedkar was much older and Dr. King was younger, but the resounding success of their struggle had some ramifications. Now, some people like the jealous people on the left critique both by saying these were modern bourgeois leaders who were manufactured without really understanding what constitutes a bourgeois culture, what constitutes a new form of cultural revolt. It's not the industrial revolution type of politics that could apply here. Where there was, if you look at Manchester, if you look at the people who are working in the mines and all, that politics, as opposed to the politics who are not necessarily working in mine but representing a group of community, really becomes a different kind of a balance. However, Ambedkar and Dr. King, not least for the issues of fighting for desegregation, access to basic institutions, creating a representation for political and equal redistribution of national wealth, not national income. This is very fundamentally kind of a complex argument that has not really facilitated at both ends. There has been a state-level discourse of Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Ambedkar, the memorialization of them, which is important for a memoralia and honoring. But alongside that, there has to be those ethics that they were fighting for, and also those logics they deployed. What were the logics? These were the logics that I state before you. First was eliminating a system that is hierarchically based and that is predetermined. Two, it was absolute control of labor by being part of the system. Third, unequal distribution of resources. Fourth, impregnable value attached to the labor as opposed to the commodity that they produce. Fifth, classic Marxist sense of the idea of surplus. Where do surplus lie after the production? And especially in a caste economy where a labor is determined to produce labor and value without attaching any value vis-a-vis to the labor, because you are still an untouchable or a lower caste. And sixth, more important in this case, is utilizing this as what Ambedkar classically called graded hierarchies, or the hierarchies within the system of inequalities, not just one, but within an equal system, how to then unite them to create a front and fighting against a larger enemy. Ambedkar saw that as caste. And that's how Dr. MLK also saw that as race. because these were utilized as tools of exploitation. And if you want to address exploitation, you want to go to the origin of where does this exploitation originate. Alongside, then, as I said, various other issues kind of form. And that's why this kind of a oppressed internationalist vision Dr. Ambedkar really brings forward. And now his theory, as happens with every great thinker, it takes time for people to mature because the ruling class doesn't find any other resource to alternate the figures. So they keep on giving new ideas, which are basically rehashing of the old ones. But at some point, that ideas have a timeline that will be questioned, and that's what happening with Ambedkar, whose ideas 100 years later now we are seeing are getting more recognized and in a much more sophisticated and an urgent sense that we would think we need now.
Thank you, Suraj. We would come back to many of the issues you raised, for instance, how to utilize the resources from below, or even the multiple appropriations of Ambedkar and so on. And interesting, you pointed out to this almost a disjuncture of the financial market-led so-called growth with the real wealth of
Yeah.
the global wealth. Yanis Varoufakis has pointed out that during the pandemic, when the GDP of UK went down 20%, there was a sharp rise in the market value,
Yeah.
which fails every logic of economics. But that's what he is calling as corporate feudalism, which has completely disassociated itself from real material basis of the common people. But this also is a very good window to bring us to one of your chapters in your book, Caste Matters, a prolific book written in a very passionate way, a memoir-like investigation into the social processes of caste. And there, in one of the essays, you have come up with a very passionate defense of socialism, where you have critique, and the two where you began is very interesting. You began with Booker T. Washington's vision of the black emancipation through black capitalism, and Dickey's vision. Sorry, as opposed to W.B. Du Bois' vision, which is much more social, cultural, and a whole transformative vision. And then you, by building on that differences, you sort of almost attack Fickey's, and you almost show in a concrete way how the emancipation project out of Brahminical capitalism in India is bound to fail. So would you please elaborate a little on this essay, because it is very important for all of us and also to our viewers.
No, thank you. Actually, in that book, as you can see, it starts with this kind of various in Caste Matters with kind of various orients. One of the things I wanted to do was to personalize the existence of these forms of inequalities for the readers who are reading. And one of the ways to personalize that was to bring my personal essence to it. I could have, if it had written in an abstract sense, people would not have necessarily asserted that example. And so the purpose was to really reorient, as I've been telling, a constant the focus. And where does that focus take us? The focus takes us beyond the polemics and beyond the rhetorics that have been formed around this whole canard of capitalism and the various debates that take place. We have to understand, that always see people have been talking about the economy being tied to the state, where state is basically creating a market for the corporate to then exploit. We have to always understand the corporate fundamentalism was always existing as a pseudo state. India is no exception to that. A moment Ambani, Adani, Tata, and three other families decide, if they so choose, that they want to create a para state, they might not be able to create, but they might be able to easily pull the rug out of the feet of the Indian state. What does that mean? That means that you are heavily reliant on it. You can talk about state and all existing, but at the end of the day, and when we talk about corporations, we have to talk about families, because these are the family owned businesses. Western capital is all about family owned businesses. You talk about any commodity that you consume in an everyday basis or essential need, look at the name. These are last names of these people. Last name is a significant comparison for India. It is a representation of the caste. Same happens with America. It's a representation of certain caste of people who came with a certain accumulated capital from a certain regions of Europe and exploited the American engine to, of course, expand their capital. Now, in this case, in our estimation of Indian understanding of capitalism, one of the prominent is that there is a necessity for capitalism to exist and liberate. Now, my story has not necessarily given me adequate reason to believe that premise. Not that I'm saying I reject that premise. I want to test it. And how do I? So I try to give it with a very micro example of my personal experience as to how capitalism really subsists and how it really exists in local Dalit communities. If that is what it is, capitalism is about a structure that exploits not only you, exploits your spirits, it exploits your gods, it exploits your soul, and the coming generations are being contaminated because you are tied into a debt economy. For caste economy, it is very simple. You are tied as a landless laborer, as a bandhua mazdoor, or there is different names in different states, which is very much a ritualistic operation of work. Labor is divorced from the idea of modern capitalist support, right? If compared to the Western labor, there is a very different reasoning in this. Now, where do we then think about Dalit capitalism as opposed to other? For me, it can be Baniya capitalism, the right way of framing it, or Brahmin capitalism, because these two communities are the wholesome owners of capital in India. Dalit capitalism is a misnomer. But again, if it's an ideal concept which is predicated on black capitalism, one has to also then look at what has happened with black capitalism. Of course, there is relative success in that, there is no doubt. Has that transferred into altering the situation of poor working class black people, men and women who are going early morning to work, coming back? Has that altered or created a system where their rights and dignities are protected, where the structure that is owning, which is basically white owned, has supported? Black people still remain vulnerable. So, by adding the logic of capitalism and to black person, what is essentially doing is it's this massive 100 whole. You are giving 1 or even less than 1% to the black or whatever group, the 99% becomes sanitized and accepted. That's the problem here. There's no problem with black capitalism or Dalit capitalism. The problem is when you use an allegory to then generalize and then validate the horrendous nature of capitalist undertaking for the existing predatory capitalism, monopoly, nasty, brutal, blood-sucking capitalism. This is where the problem arises, and that's my reservation comes in. However, if the Dalit capitalist can prove that they are kosher, one can then work with that. But you should know this is an RSS ploy. The person who is the founder of the Dicky, Milind Kamble, is a RSS fellow. So we have to also bring the Brahminical elements into this. And at the end of the day, Congress and RSS are sweet bedfellows. They are not even strange bedfellows. They work hand in gloves when it comes to exploiting the resources, exploiting this land, and exploiting the people who belong to SC, ST, OBC, Muslim communities.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you clarified that the term Dalit capitalism in itself is a misnomer, and your book points to studies that have shown that about 92% of the wealth is held by the upper caste, out of whom maybe 88% would be the Banyas and the Brahmins. And on the point about the power of Adani and Ambani to pull off the feet from the state. I mean, there is this very classic question typically asked in Marxist classrooms that if you want to win an election, parliamentary forms of election, whom do you go first, your voters or the big corporations who have
Yeah.
the media and who can mobilize transportations and so on? And often people are misled to believe, we go to the voters, but that comes in the end, if at all it comes. uh, Anyway, so this brings us to. I have a few more questions, but for the sake of a little democracy here, I would ask my friend Ayushman to ask his few questions that he has.
Yeah, thank you, Dushman. So, hi, Suraj. So, you kind of in the last question, you kind of said, there should be, the solidarity of Muslims, OBC, SC, STs. So at a time of rising Hindu nationalism in India, and also the onslaught of global Islamophobia, the
Mhm.
political marginalization of Muslims is a serious concern. So historically, poor Dalits are used by upper caste Hindus to
Yeah, yeah.
act as clients, furthering the majoritarianism, like the Cursor works in Babri Masjid demolition, the Delhi anti-Sikh program, and the Gujarat riots. So, what are your thoughts on this?
See, it is a clientele Brahminism. We have to understand it in this context. The Brahminic elements, the Brahmins mostly, appoint clients for their services to be delivered. And it is nothing but a commerce of emotion and hegemony. And it works both ways, for emotional level as well as hegemonic level. Now, for a poor working class who is smoking bidi after the toil of labor, they need a reason to feel equal, a reason to feel belonging. They need a motivation the state cannot give, because it's a Brahminical state run and ruled by Brahmin Banyas. So what alternative do they provide? They provide an enemy that can then stabilize. Michel Foucault talks that violence is necessary for the state, because without violence the state will cease to exist. Why do you need then state, right? If there is no violence, we can all live harmoniously in our neighborhoods and share and equally whatever it takes. However, the marginalization of Muslim in the Indian context has happened not least because of the rise of BJP, but because the polarization that was created by Congress. They already tokenized the Muslim as a token figure. And that happened because of the North Indian politics of the Brahmins and other Savarnas to create a Indic or India as a notion as opposed to nation. When they were creating this Indic India notion, they wanted a communal harmony. But that communal harmony was already manufactured by the making of Pakistan. Now, there is very little you could do to appease the people when there was two state, when the two-state formula was proposed. Now the problem is, it is not only Muslims, but it is also other groups who want to challenge the unification of India in this sense. The Sikh want their own regional land, the Bodos want their land, and other regions also would, like South Indian states, definitely see themselves as not part of the Hindi belt in any way that it takes. Now, in the marginalization of Muslims, I've always told with data that it is not the Savarna convert Muslims. It is not the children of Mughal dynasts or aristocrats or the people who were working in the courts of all these invaders from Central Asia. These are the lower caste, the Shudra, the SC, ST, converts Musliman who are working in the same profession almost, selling petty things on the street, making a profit out of informal labor or the profession they are doing. And on the other side, as a Hindu saffron wielding person, is also SC, ST, OBC. So the Brahmins of Hindus and Muslims use the concept of Hindu Muslims for SC, ST, OBC to keep fighting amongst themselves. Now, this is very evident. Omar Abdullah, the Abdullahs, for example, right? Abdullah's great grandfather was a Brahmin, Kashmiri Pandit. Understand? Nehru's or current Rahul Gandhi's great grandfathers were Kashmiri Pandits. In many ways, these are siblings. But the issue of Kashmir is twisted as a Hindu-Muslim kind of issue of a communal nature, and that then trickles down, or in a way it is forced upon the rest of India to now pay attention to the Hindu-Muslimization of the causes. When if you highlight the history of Muslim through a caste history, through a history of indigeneity, through a history of what their ancestors were, not necessarily denying them the permission of belonging to this nation, then there is a real. How do you make a Muslim belong to this nation? Just their history, their ancestors are Indian. But by making and adding a prefix of Islam, it's immediately otherized. So in any so-called communal conflict, and Dilip Menon has already proved that in his excellent treatise, in his book, where he went to actually the colonial era debate, especially the 20th century debates, Caste in modern India, where he looked at colonial India, where he looked at formation of caste-based identities amongst the Uttar Pradesh and the regional context, but then it goes down to really retaining the hegemony of castes. And I think that text needs to be read by every person who is interested in the Muslim and Hindu question or Hindu nationalism. That text really puts it into a context that will give us more understanding as to why we are not able to find the solution. See, black and white exist, right? But there are black Muslims as well. There are black Christians, black Protestants, black Jews. However, the history is all about color differences that has happened in this context. So the black person knows, even though the person is Muslim, he is still nevertheless a black. We need to tell these people who have gone into various religions about this history. Whenever a riot takes place, be it Babri Masjid or be it Godhra, these are SCs and STs and majority OBCs who participate because of their sheer numbers. But if we tell them, actually the people you are going beating in the Godhra or they're trying to do the riots against Muslims are actually also SC, ST, OBCs. If this context is brought into this, we will. But our India's progressive so-called liberals, so-called leftists, they don't want to engage with this because they are at the end of the day themselves Savarnas who want to create a mythos of a certain divide that might not necessarily address. And see, we have tried this, right? After independence, we have tried using this logic and it has failed. Now I think it's time that we pay attention to creating this kind of solidarity of the poor people. And one way to work is working class. The other way is to giving the real identity, the real gods, so to say, gods in the sense of not I'm saying God, but the real ancestors to them and say, this is you, and be comfortable in whatever you belong. Doesn't mean Indian Muslim has to swear only by the Saudi Arabian mosque. They can also be given opportunity to have an hybridity where there is a complexity, yeah, but at the same time there is also feeling of belonging and also retaining your faith that you want to hold on to.
Thank you, Suraj. Very interesting to that, typically the communal problem is not seen, at least in the liberal left discourse, not seen through the prism of caste. Yeah, and you're very right. And uh, I'm glad you stretched the analysis in a historical time sense, because these projects, the Arya Samaj, this project that you are referring to, went well into the late 19th and the early 28th century. And we know there are studies, Nandini Gupta's studies of the politics of the urban poor in UP is one of those great studies that points out to this forced unification process, the Hinduization process that led to the some of this communal conflict. It also reminds me of Ambedkar's point in Annihilation of Caste, where he said that the only time where Hindus are equal is when they have to,
Yeah,
yeah, confront the Muslims.
yeah.
Do you tell us how many more minutes can you stay back?
Is it okay for another 30 minutes?
Okay, that's good. That's great. So, I would bring the question of religion into this, and here the context is important. The Navayana, Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism in the last moments, perhaps 7 weeks before he died. Nicola Joel, I guess, he has analyzed very well
Yeah.
the impact of this. And also, he has argued that how Ambedkar's view of religion goes much beyond Marx or Gramsci's strategic sympathy for religion, let's say on the Jewish question and so on. But at the same time, Ambedkar was also not harking back to a kind of traditional way of
Yeah.
religion. It was, in a sense, a modernist project, but not having the Eurocentric garb of dichotomies of rationality and so on.
That's
Now,
right.
that's a very interesting essay. I'm not asking you on that. My question is, I'm picking up from where he ended, that there is also a challenge, internal challenge from within the Dalits, that the Ambedkarite activists face, despite having socioeconomic indicators that say that the Buddhist Dalits have fared much better in terms of socioeconomic indicators. Very poor, and I think Defler has done work on this. That the Balmikis and the
Yeah.
non-Jatavs, the poorest of the Dalits, they might be averse, or in many cases we know they are averse to
Yeah.
the Navayana form of. So, can you tell us more about this? What are the challenges and what's the picture?
I mean, see, conversion from one faith to another is always a very demanding task, because it is not just conversion of faith, it is conversion of your identity, it is conversion of your location in a society, and as well as the history will be altered after that, right? Now, one of the things is the Valmiki community, which is the lowest among the Dalits, remains at the disposal of the Hindutva groups. The Brahminical outfits rely on their labor, not least their traditional labor, but also their labor to commit offense and violence. And they have never managed to create icons within Valmiki community, but they gave one Hindu name to a sage called Valmiki and told them he wrote the epic, and now you have to, and this is the kind of chocolate that they have been giving to the community. But very interestingly, in the North India, the radical Ambedkarites come from Valmiki community, who have really worked with Ambedkar, not least, but also created a different perspective to engage with the notions of Valmiki Samaj, right? And many Valmikis still live with the inferiority complex of belonging to the Hindu religion. They don't want to come out, and there is this whole, like Yashika Dutt is a Valmiki, and she wrote in a whole story about how she was hiding. Now she was out of India, and she was Columbia graduate, so she could ascend and assert herself. But nevertheless, she grew up as a Hindu, not necessarily herself practicing, but within the culture and norms of Hindu. Even the last name doesn't represent, So you see that. But on the other hand, the Ambedkarite Buddhists are very strong. They claim their identity, and they not only claim, they reassert, they take back whatever was taken from them. It's a very radical proposition. And for them, Buddha is an identity that is about this non-violent kind of revolution that Buddha did. Ambedkar's Buddhism, although he never had a chance to work much on Navayana Buddhism that we talk, he mentioned in one of speeches, what people ask what kind of Buddhism it will be. There is Heenyan, there is Theravada, what is this? And so he said, let's call it a Navayana, a new vehicle of Buddhism. And then people really took it forward. And basically, every leader or every thinker gets promoted to the thought by the followers, the kind of investment they do. Now, what's the difficulty here among the conversions to your question? It is that when we are shifting the gears of faith, it really falls into the domain of caste pride. Now, for oppressed caste people, there is no pride that has been written into the texts, be it Ramayana or Mahabharata. It is always withdrawing, it is always heaping insults on them. What brings pride then? Pride, new faith becomes pride. That's why many scheduled caste people went to faith of Islam, because it was like, whatever, at the end of the day, we will share the same meal and pray under the same roof. So this is the best thing we can get. We've been asking for this. And it also shifted the game in the sense that it gave access to certain resources and people could, assimilate. Within the conversion to Ambedkarite Buddhist lens, it's not just conversion of convenience. It's a conversion of conviction. You are then convicting yourself to annihilating caste, to making India a Prabuddha Bharat, an enlightened India where it was once, where values and laws were in relatively better standards than what we see today, be it Ashoka's India or the subsequent, Indic Buddhist civilization. So there is a promise, there is a way that we should go, and there have been several studies about how was the state of economy during the time of when it was when Buddhism, or Buddhism as a sense of not ism, but the values of Buddha were central to the workings and functioning of state and foreign relations. So it's a very interesting kind of complexity that kind of brings into picture. We want to convert people, but the aim should be beyond the statistics. It should be really conversion of mind. It should be, as I said, it also should be conviction. And in addition, as we go onwards, it should be a firm devotion. So people who became Ambedkarite Buddhists, they are uncompromising people. You can't really mess up with them when it comes to questions of caste, liberation. They know their history, they have read it, and recently we had just observed a passing of one Mr. Karim Puri, who was a Punjabi Ambedkarite Buddhist, grew up in a typical, Chamar family, got converted to Buddhism, and then his life is all about circling around social revolution. Now, how revolutionary that can be by just adopting an ideology, and he died, and they practiced Ambedkarite Buddhist rituals. They didn't wanted any monk to have this other spiritual kind of thing. They said, we want Ambedkarite Buddhist monk, and if there is nobody, we will just not do it without you. We will just observe him. So see, there is a liberation, and the dichotomy here is not about reason and faith, or rationalism and religion. It's about what sort of confidence this gives you to conduct your life. And I think this is a great example as to how a community lived and gave his subsequent generation a proud Buddhist identity. And you will see many Buddhists from Ambedkarite community are extremely proud of their identity. They sometimes don't even want to identify with the Dalit identity. They say, we are no more Dalit, we are Buddhist. So that's the kind of confidence that it comes from this faith.
Thank you so much. Since you have referred to and you have written about the cultural transformation, along with the sort of more changes in material base, or if we like the word, and you have been writing about Dalit cinema, on which Ayushman has a question. So I would ask Ayushman to ask his question, and then maybe we can club the two questions, and then you can take both at the same time since they are very similar.
Okay.
Ayushman, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So, in your article, like Dalit Cinema, you have talked about how academics and critics of film studies compromise the issue of caste by using this new liberal linguistic and globalization framework. Okay, so you have shown the blatant casteism of the Indian cinema through Bollywood movies and the CBFC censoring caste as sensitive topic, and thereby rejecting movies that assert Dalitness. You know,
Yeah.
your analysis of Dalit cinema through the two movies, Sairat and Kandri, is like promising. So how do you see today non-Dalits and Savarnas directing films like
Right.
Article 15, Asuran, and recent J film? So how do you reanalyze today in this context? And also coming to the next question, how do you see the Tamil industry which leading these various caste questions, they're raising this question, and the role of OTT platforms in helping Dalit cinema evade these CBFC casteist or this gaze. And thirdly, I would like because this is the recent controversy of this communism and Ambedkar, that has been reignited by the movie Jai Bhim. So how do you what's your view on it? So
Unfortunately, Aishan, I'm a very slow film watcher. I really, I like watching movies, but I really feel like I'm spending too much time in front of screen when I'm watching movies somehow. But never. So I've not seen Article 15 yet. Although I've read some reviews, I've spoken to some film friends in the Bollywood who are directors about their opinions, and they are very critical of it. Similarly, I have not seen Jai Bhim, and also I have not seen Sarpatta, even though my friend Ranjit has directed. I sent him a message, and I think it's based on me because I haven't watched it yet. But I sent him, I'm sorry, I have not watched it. So, but I will make a point sometime this semester to sitting and watching it, right? But I will give you a response beyond the cinema as to what it. See, for me, Savarnas have always been directing movies about Dalits. Who is the worker in Amitabh Bachchan, right? Um, who is, for example, Nagraj Manjule, the Marathi film director, he told me when he watched, his favorite actor is Amitabh Bachchan, and he said whenever he watched Zanjeer and all the 70s angry young man films, he saw the story there. It's such an interesting thing. He didn't see it as, because the names and all of them, they had a context, but they were afraid to mention Dalit because they are afraid of Dalit rebellion. If you give Dalit enough cultural armament, they are afraid of that. But nevertheless, this wheel was meant to turn at some point, and it's turning. It's the law of nature. It's the law of Dhamma, going around. This moment that we see is, I call, it's a Dalit Harlem moment. There was no other word I could have described it, because Harlem also had this modern renaissance of a cultural, we haven't seen equivalent anywhere, at least in modern history, anywhere else in the world. So we have found our own moment, and it will be maybe different. Maybe it will be a Dalit, we will create our, maybe it's a Dalit Tamil moment, maybe Tamil land is a land of that, which is providing this kind of a new feeder for politics of a future. Now, Central Board censoring this is a very serious issue we should take on, because Kakus, the film made by Divya, which is about manual scavengers, a documentary, Central Board had refused the certification, saying it's too socially this and that and that. How do you describe a social without having a representation of it? It's a political body. It's appointed by the government of India and all the government supporter states. It's not like a bipartisan, you know what I mean? It's not commonly held consensus. And so I think there are many films actually. I was recently, not recently, but when I was researching for that article, I spoke to one director in Andhra Pradesh. Even his film was under the, waiting for a few years with, I think, CPFC. And he said he's not the only one. He sees also other important social issue cinemas. But very interestingly, this Bollywood cheap stamp gets like approval, and you get the certificate every front of the screen that this is what we achieved. I don't know what's the purpose there for the, again, in that sense also, what is the purpose of the Indian government to intervene in certain forms of, fortunately, certain level of intimacy is accepted on screen, but earlier it was flowers who were having intimacy in the name of human beings. But now we are seeing it's kind of slowly progressing. This could change if we totally realign the structure of CBFC, and I'm hopeful that this something of this sort could happen in near future.
Thank you so much, Suraj. I would place my question right there because it's in a way it's similar, and it's on uh, rethinking education for the oppressed or of the oppressed. And I'm not asking on the narrow questions of reservation and so on. And I mean, for our viewers, if you want, I think Teltumbre's Republic of Caste has one of the most prolific essays on the issue of reservation, which everyone should read. And just for the record, in terms of reservation, 0.002% of the entire workforce is covered under reservation. But we would sidestep that. My question is more on the larger issue of how do we rethink a more inspiring project where the Dalits and the oppressed can have their own sense of moments of inspiration for their education. For instance, the upper caste can or the privileged can always choose to focus on the atomic structure of an atom and molecule, and it's a liberating exercise in a way to think of things that are not sensory. In a way, you can think about the black holes, you can think about the subatomic structure of an atom when you wish to, but for the marginalized there is a reduction of the whole not just the identity but your whole psychological process is reduced to a singularity, that you are the oppressed, and you choose to think about your own caste position, or you don't mention it at all and go with the mainstream dominant flow, and we have to avoid both of them. So how do we make education inspiring for the oppressed?
See, we need to first of all educate the oppressors, because they are the ones who are creating much barriers into understanding or creating an equitable space. They are not egalitarian thinkers. Unfortunately, the young children from the dominant caste communities, they are indoctrinated by ideology that produces and presents them as victims. And when they see themselves as victims, they become protectors of their own dignity, which is misinterpreted as a rightful, meritorious, and whatnot. So we really need a curriculum for the re-education, like what Mao did with when it happened, the Cultural Revolution. He took all the privileged people first, and he said, go to villages, go the labor there. He took all the European educated thinkers and artists and painters, and he sent them to get an education of rural people. And he said, once you get 2-3 year education, then we will have this. And we need a approach that will put the Savarna people into the position of what it is to live the life of a Dalit, not necessarily Dalit as a human being, as a labor, as a co-worker, as a friend, but Dalit as a fellow citizen. And I think that kind of political relationship has to be established, because that is the end of the problem. And once the Savarnas are, so that's why we need a center for Savarna re-education. We need a Savarna re-education society where Savarnas, and I've been telling in my book also, I talk about, right, Brahmins need to form their own groups against caste. The Savarna groups need to form against their group. Don't need to work always with Dalits. Dalit groups can be your allies. But if your job is to liberate and eliminate caste and reform the social structure, you need to form your own allies, because we need to address the problem maker. Within working class struggle, we don't talk about working class, we talk about the oppressor. and how the oppressor needs to be treated and all of that. Similarly, we need to put a focus on them, because the Dalit, for example, they're already doing, the work that they necessarily takes. They're living. Survival for Dalit is an achievement every day. So we need to assess in that parlance, and hopefully in Ashoka or in Delhi University, there will be Savarna students, I hope, who will form their own groups against caste. Let's say Brahmins against caste. Let's say subcaste Brahmins, Gaud Saraswat Brahmins, or Menans against caste, or Nayars against caste, or for that matter, Yadavs against caste. Unless and until we have anti-caste groups, and and again, people misunderstand when I say this. I don't mean to say start against a caste group only putting Dalit in perspective. Against caste is also because you are part of a caste system and you are also in the hierarchy. So you need to bring that anti-caste lens so that you could also be liberated. So people have re-understood this as only being a Dalit or non-Dalit issue. It's also about your issue. And if you get a Dalit perspective to liberate you, that's the easiest way we can find so far.
We are coming to a close. I wonder if we can have one last question. If you can.
Let's take it one. Let's take it one.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It reminds me of how feminist scholars have often responded to this question. About the necessity of man educating themselves rather than always thinking about women's education, and so. So my last question is maybe slightly off track. I have been thinking about this, and I hope many would do, about the local self-government. I mean, and how it becomes much more complicated, because on one hand there have been talks for a very long time about the idea of uh, bottom up uh, organization of the society. At the same time, India's case complicates this problem, because the bottom layers, I mean, as Ambedkar had enough to be cynical about, I mean, these are in a way horrible chambers of caste and superstitious dogmatism and so on. So how do you look at it? Because there is a problem in over centralization. I mean, no sane thinker would say that let's create a state that would deliver everything to us. But at the same time, this idea of a revolution from below, I mean, that doesn't happen all the time. So in that interim period, what's the role of the state, and how do you look at this centralization decentralization debate?
I mean, one of the things is the Panchayati Raj Act was passed, and that was the purpose to really kind of stabilize in many ways the kind of rural, kind of urban difference, right? And India as a state cannot exist by having a unified center heart. It wouldn't work because of this immense diversity and immense complicated function. The macro state at a certain, and again, Delhi should not be the center of India's capital. It should be what Ambedkar also proposed, second capital, Hyderabad or somewhere, actual center, people can actually visit. And why is that so? Because, if you want to make power accountable, you need it to be accessible. I was at a Left Forum, one of the kind of a leading organizing conferences in America, academic conferences. They asked me to, to comment or to speak on, is it an era for Dalit revolution yet? They had a panel, and I was like, it's not possible, because the segregation is so stark, not least physical segregation, but also spatial. Spaces are divided. And a person, if you want to, let's say, when the French Revolution was happening, when they stormed the Bastille, the fort, it was accessible. For Dalits, these spaces are not accessible. Similarly, for black people, especially in South Africa, are not accessible. The white-dominated or even black-dominated class spaces. So we need a decentralization in the effect that it will not give an authority to the local feudal lord. That's what has happened. Congress is responsible, and Dr. Anand Teltumde who we all should read but also protest against his arrest, who is still languished in prison without even a trial, and many other people are undergoing the same fate, who are progressive activists fighting for poor people, Dalit Adivasis. Dr. Anand Teltumde had argued that it was the Congress's making to create a local feudal, because it was a fear under the Ambedkar's influence. Ambedkar's influence was challenging Congress right and left. And for them to contain that rural angst, that would have really flipped the point. They got the local landlords as Congress people, and many of them were not interested in politics, but they got them, gave them positions, and 70 years later, the same are biting them. Now, be it Jagan's Congress in Andhra Pradesh or NCP here in Maharashtra, and you know the BJP rise is basically Congress is this against the fifth. Why do people vote for BJP, especially from the oppressed caste? Not necessarily we don't have enough number, but whoever vote there is this fate that these people who are Reddis, Kammas, Marathas, in some places Yadavs, these were the Kurmis, Ahirs. Although these are the people who belong to the subaltern caste, but they had a land and they were eventually politicized to control and contain the rebellion formed by Ambedkar consciousness in many ways. And so I think we need to also be sensitive to that decentralization of and not just politics but economy, because that's where the thesis and premise will come, unless and until economy is held accountable on each level. Not just you have to go to central commission, but also local commission where you have your own economic issues. Maybe there is an industry that is, maybe a factory that is polluting, or maybe there is a certain small scale whatever industry that has been formed. What is the premise of that? Where does it function? What laws do they govern? Is it a central excise law or is also a state excise law? Unless and until we market that and democratize that in the sense of providing a kind of a framework of caste, we will not have a proper decentralization, because decentralization again has reintroduced a state. And by the way, for decentralization, Mayawati should be credited, because she created all this breaking of big hegemonic Uttar Pradesh into Uttaranchal, and that's the genius of that, because the smaller the state, the better the governance. But we don't really give Mayawati much of the credit, because we still think she is a Dalit, she is incapable of having a class politics. In fact, the most progressive class politics was then after Ambedkar Kanshiram. If you look at his policies, especially in the UP state, because that's where they had the government, the redistribution of land, allocation of housing, basic services. What is left fighting for? These basic services. To have the representation of workers, you will see that being done, and also kind of creating a anti-Brahminical politics, which is again agenda of the left, which is not to create polarizing. But for that we really need a anti-caste nuance, or else we will just repeat what the media says and then we become another pawn in the tail.
On that note, we'd end. Before we go, we must thank you. We are so grateful you were here, and thank you for putting the perspective of caste and race in alongside class. And not to forget, we must all, including the whole global community, bring Indian government into account, who has put not just Dr. Anand Teltumde, but many more, perhaps 7,000 in the last 4 years, under the charge of sedition by using the draconian UAPA law, and we condemn it. And on that note, we would like to end. Thank you
You
so
should
much.